Thank you, Senator Singh. Senator Waters.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Climate Change Bill's repeal package. And in order to understand the significance of what this government is now seeking to do in overturning the country's first national climate laws, I want to reflect on the clean energy package, its genesis and its success. The clean energy package was a truly remarkable and incredible achievement of the last parliament. And in my short time here, it's been the most significant day that I've had the pleasure of being involved in and being a part of. On that day, I was really proud of this parliament. I was proud that we'd started to take the action necessary to safeguard our way of life, not just for my daughter, but for all future generations to come. I was proud for the fact that we'd taken action for the people of this generation, who are already suffering the impacts of climate change, our Pacific neighbours and our Torres Strait Islander communities already facing saltwater incursion into low-lying farmland, and of course all of those around the world who suffer from extreme weather events, which are sadly becoming more intense and more frequent. I was proud that we'd taken action for all of the other creatures that we share this planet with. And I was proud that we'd set aside the short-term interests of a vested few and actually acted in the public interest and for the good of all future generations. And lastly, I was proud that we'd looked to the science and that we'd considered not just the needs of ourselves, but of those to come. This parliament did something that really mattered that day, and I want to take this chance tonight to publicly acknowledge and thank and pay tribute to the leadership of both Senator Bob Brown, former leader of the Australian Greens, and Senator Christine Milne, of course the leader of the Australian Greens, for driving that climate action. And I want to particularly single out Senator Milne for her tenacity and her determination in raising the issue of climate change long before it was a mainstream issue, and in just never giving up, and in managing to keep a smile on her face throughout. So I pay tribute to Senator Milne. In the short time that we've seen the carbon price operating, it's demonstrated a number of things. Firstly, it's demonstrated that we can in fact take the action that we need to safeguard our way of life and to ready our economy for the low-carbon future that the rest of the world is already moving towards. It's demonstrated that we can do that without economic shockwaves, and in fact with the growth of new sectors, and not just any new sectors, job-rich new sectors, which both sides of this parliament frequently claim to be concerned about. Job-rich sectors like clean energy, like tourism, like manufacturing. But the key thing that the carbon price has demonstrated so far is that it's actually working. It's already lowered our national emissions, and it's done so profitably. And likewise, the complementary measures have seen renewable energy flourish. We have the real start of a new economy here, and we know that that renewable energy takes pressure off peak demand, and we know that that means it brings down electricity prices, and is particularly important in the recent heat waves. Now, of course, the scheme was not perfect. We saw that there was overly generous compensation, in our view, to the big polluters, but that was also planned to be subject to review as the years progressed. And if indeed the age of entitlement is over, as we are sometimes told by this government, those sort of subsidies should be examined, along with the other fossil fuel subsidies that rank in the billions of dollars every year that is meted out to those very profitable, often multinational fossil fuel companies by the taxpayer. They don't need the help, and probably nor did they ever. But likewise, if these laws were to be repealed, and I'll harken back to that in the course of this contribution, should this repeal pass the parliament, there would be a windfall gain to those fossil fuel companies of $450 million per year. And that's just the cost of their fugitive emissions, the leaking gas wells, the gassy coal mines under the carbon price. In total, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, the post-election report, abolishing the carbon price would remove $7.3 billion from the government's revenue stream. Now, at a time when revenue forecasts are shrinking and we're seeing cut after cut after cut to all of the things that we hold dear, to universities, to single parents, even now to Medicare, that great institution, at that time when we have a need for additional revenue streams, why on earth is this government countenancing the loss of $7.3 billion every year? It boggles the mind, and it must simply be ideology that's driving this government and not evidence. And of course we see that with the Commission of Audit's Razor Gang. If it were evidence-based, then this government would at least be seeking to retain the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, that magnificently successful organisation, that $10 billion renewable energy bank, if you like, that's not only seen emissions reduced, but that's actually been making the government money, and that is stimulating a new, incredibly profitable and exciting sector of our economy. If indeed it were evidence driving this government's decisions, then they would be retaining that Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So much so, sadly, that we see that the lack of evidence just pervades, and all the more so when it comes to the science itself, and perhaps climate science most of all. The most confronting example of that in recent times has been when the government has put a climate skeptic in charge of the Renewable Energy Target Review. That target, of course, which was just reviewed by the Climate Change Authority, who are actual scientists, not 18 months ago. And they are, of course, scheduled to do an update to that in about 6 months' time. But sadly, this government wants to abolish them as well. But I'm really proud that today this chamber voted to keep that science-based independent organisation. That organisation who just last week recommended that in fact Australians' emissions targets need to be increased. If we are to follow the science and tackle climate change, that we should be increasing our reduction target to 19% by 2020. And yet this government wants a 5% target. And it's not even actually prepared to spend the money to meet that 5% target. It's quarantined $3 billion to spend on its bizarre direct action policy, but it's admitted countless times that should that money not produce a 5% cut in emissions, well, it doesn't matter. Well, we won't throw any more money at it. It doesn't really matter if we don't meet that 5%. It doesn't care. But sadly, that 5% target is itself far too low, and it will do nothing to help prevent more extreme drought, bushfires, and economic ruin fuelled by global warming. And that's what we're talking here tonight when we talk about climate change. It's not just some, as the Prime Minister said, some invisible, odourless and weightless substance. And no doubt he got a wealth of scientific advice on that statement, given that we now no longer have a science minister in this parliament. It's about the extreme weather events that this country is actually already facing. But we're in a climate emergency, and when you look at the predictions from the government's own advisors about what we stand to face under a changing climate, it is really very confronting. In Queensland, in my home state, I want to read into the record here some of the impacts, projected impacts of global warming. Firstly, for Brisbane, and this is from a combination of sources, mostly Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO. It says that Brisbane will experience more variable rainfall and stronger winds, leading to more extreme weather events. Extreme rainfall intensity is projected to increase, which could lead to more flooding. We already saw what happened with the 2011 devastating floods. It says coastal areas are at high risk, and up to 67,700 residential buildings are at risk of inundation from a sea level rise of just 1.1 metres. That same sea level rise would also put up to 4,700 kilometres of Queensland's roads, up to 570 kilometres of Queensland's railways, and up to 1,440 commercial buildings at risk. Likewise, the number of days in Brisbane above 35 degrees could go from 1 up to 21 a year by 2070, and we sadly know the effect that those extreme heat days can have on the elderly and the young. Now, in central Queensland, the projections are likewise hotter weather and drier conditions that could lead to extreme and more frequent fire behaviour. Now, we've had quite a lot of that lately, and none of us would wish it to continue unnecessarily. It says the fire season will start earlier and end later. There'll be an increased fire frequency in the region and more areas will be burned. The area will experience more variable rainfall, stronger winds and droughts, leading to more extreme weather events. The projections are also that there could be an increase in tropical category 3 to 5 cyclones, and that by 2030 there could be an increase of up to 60% in severe storm intensity and a 140% increase by 2070. Look, the facts continue, and they're all incredibly sobering. In far north Queensland, an increased spread of diseases such as malaria and dengue fever due to more favourable conditions for vectors. Ecosystem changes and extinctions in the wet tropics rainforests, increased heat-related illnesses, and of course flooding, erosion and damage to infrastructure associated with sea level rise. I could go on, sadly. These are very, very sobering facts, but it's not just the human cost and the human misery that will come from a failure to address runaway climate change. Our iconic plants and animals will also suffer. Our biodiversity will shrink, and the world's biodiversity will suffer. Today is inaugural UN World Wildlife Day, and today humanity was urged by two learned folk, Bradley Chambers, the Executive Secretary of the UNEP Convention on Migratory Species, and by Christina Figueres, hopefully not talking out of her hat today, as the Prime Minister once contended. She's, of course, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. They said today, in talking about the need for an international agreement in 2015, that the agreement will come not a moment too soon for species like the monarch butterfly, the humpback whale, the polar bear, turtles and countless other species for which millennia have migrated across ancient routes spanning hundreds and thousands of miles. They say that climate change is clearly already impacting many animals and plants and could spell extinction for some without urgent action. Now, we all know that polar bears in the Arctic are already challenged by several years of thawing, melting and thinning ice, making it harder and harder for some to hunt and to find food. And meanwhile, warmer beaches are affecting the hatching patterns of marine turtles. Cooler beaches produce predominantly male hatchlings, while warmer beaches produce mostly females. So we have a whole lot of lady turtles, and that's not good news for future reproduction. Blue whales also have to now migrate further from their feeding grounds in warmer waters to their breeding grounds in the cooler parts of the sea, and their main food source of krill is declining because of changes in temperature and acidification of the oceans due to climate change. And likewise our precious reef. And as a Queenslander, the Great Barrier Reef really holds a special place in, I hope, all of our hearts. And sadly, the latest science that we're seeing coming out says that the reef actually probably won't withstand a 2-degree rise, that it's only a 1-degree rise that will see severe coral bleaching in the reef. Now, that's incredibly disturbing given that we're already at a 0.9-degree rise at this point in history. Of course, it's not just temperatures that will do damage. Ocean acidification makes it harder for corals to form and weakens the existing coral structures. And yet, we have approvals for new mega coal mines and for coal ports handed out like they're lollies and just tossed around like confetti. In the Galilee Basin, up in north central Queensland, we have plans for coal mines that are just enormous, 3 times as big as the current biggest coal mine that we've got in this country, and there's many of them planned for that region. If we don't keep that coal in the Galilee Basin in the ground, then we don't have a chance of constraining global warming to any kind of livable climate. And in fact, Bill McKibben, who came out to visit Australia last year, has done some calculations and says, of the world's carbon budget, if we do want to keep to 2 degrees, of that entire carbon budget for every single country in the world, if the Galilee Basin coal were mined and burnt, that would represent 6% of the world's budget forevermore to keep us to a livable climate. So the sheer size of these resources and the potential damage that they stand to do to our way of life, to our economy, to our planet, it just boggles the mind. Of course, much of that coal from those areas is exported through the Great Barrier Reef. We already have 12 coal ports, but apparently that's not enough. This government wants to approve yet more and expand those existing ones even more, with mass dredging and offshore dumping of that dredge spoil, and of course treating the reef just like a highway for ships carrying coal and gas. So we see both the direct impacts on the reef from a doubling and in fact tripling in some cases, depending on your time frame, of coal export. And then we see the terrible climate impacts when that coal is burnt. People will have seen, I'm sure, the approval of Abbott Point, giving us now the dubious honour of the world's largest coal port in a World Heritage Area, in our Great Barrier Reef. Now, I think that is a true tragedy. And we've seen over the weekend evidence from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, who've said that, in fact, it's perfectly clear on the science that this proposal is bad news, and that offshore dumping of that dredge spoil is going to do devastating impacts to the reef. Apparently that didn't really matter to the minister, and again science seems to come down a very long list of other considerations, mostly the profits of foreign multinational mining companies. But on the reef, it's clear to me that people really care about the reef, and they care about the plants and animals that we share this world with, and they care about the sort of world that they want to leave for their own children and for generations to come. And to that end, in the short time I've got left, I want to share with the Chamber a few of the contributions that have been emailed to me by Queenslanders, by email and by Facebook, people who are really concerned about the backward step that this government wants to take on climate, and who can't understand why anyone would have such a lack of perspective to do this. The first fellow, David Bruce, says, "To me it's really simple. I now have a granddaughter, just 18 months old, and I nor anyone else have the right to jeopardise her future. My granddaughter will need a lot of things, but most of all she'll need clean air, clean water, clean soil. A biosphere that's habitable, that's what she needs. We must provide this." Jay Lawrence says, "I was one of the 60,000 people that marched for climate action in November. I want my baby grandchildren to grow up and be able to enjoy fresh drinking water, to be able to see the Great Barrier Reef and all of the wonderful and diverse marine life within those waters, and to have the same quality of life that I had as a child. I'm rallying on behalf of the future generations. That's the least I can do. As stewards of this land, we must take care to maintain it in as good a condition as we possibly can. We should aim higher towards clean energy initiatives. It is our duty as human beings." Now, there's many other contributions that sadly I don't have time this evening to share, but I look forward to sharing those in future times. I wanted to take the chance, though, to pay tribute to some of the community groups in Queensland that have been working tirelessly to protect our environment, and particularly on climate issues. So I want to mention conservation groups along the Great Barrier Reef coast, including the Mackay Conservation Group and the North Queensland Conservation Council. I want to particularly mention all the young people at the Australian Youth Climate Coalition in Queensland and across the nation. Just amazing young kids who are so active in their democracy and who are really fighting for their right to a decent future. I want to also mention community groups like 350.org and Market Forces, and of course the landholders and community groups in our beautiful farming regions of Queensland, who are taking a strong stand against the coal and coal seam gas mining that is pillaging their land and recklessly threatening their groundwater supplies. There are so many people who are fighting for a safe climate and who are fighting for the sort of future that I want my daughter to have. I'm really proud to stand in this place to say that the Greens will always back them, and we will back strong climate action. And we will do everything that we can to make sure that this government doesn't tear down the progress that we have finally started to make so belatedly and yet so importantly. Today we've seen the retention of the Climate Change Authority. I'm hopeful that we will be able to retain the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Things are going to change here after July, but I'm confident that the science will speak, the evidence will speak and the good sense will speak, and that in fact we may be able to retain several aspects of our climate laws. I think that's what we all need to work to deliver. It's not all doom and gloom. I think we actually have quite a bright and exciting future. If we see this as an opportunity and start investing in the low-carbon economy of the future, This will not only be good for business, but it will be good for the planet and it will be good for future generations. I caution the government against proceeding down this path, and I look, despite all indications to the contrary, with optimism for the future.